Greetings and welcome to this session, which is an unusual session, and I think a particularly important session for the kind of analysis and thinking and discovery which we're trying to do in the seminar. Because the question here is a very fundamental one. It's the question, how do human values, human ethical commitments, human normative systems, what is their history? How are they related to real biologically given human beings? What is the nature and the history and the origin of human values and ethical systems? And I'm wanting to put forward a specific idea, a very large idea, which I'd like for you to consider and think about. And I have a couple of thinkers that I would like to bring to bear on this idea. But the fundamental idea is that human beings are self-creating organisms. We are organisms who extend our world, our technical world, our social world, and our moral world through culture and technology. We have a capacity for creating ourselves and creating the world in which we inhabit, including the social world that we inhabit. Human beings have cognitive and emotional capacities with a very broad range. We're different from other organisms, many other organisms, so it's very possible that there are some other species on the planet which have some of the same cognitive and emotional capabilities or complex cognitive and emotional capabilities, which are also worthy of discussion. But for sure, human beings have cognitive and emotional capacities in a very broad range, which permit us to create and embody a wide range of cultural practices and moral systems. And indeed, history is made by human beings. History is a series of moments through which culture and moral practice develop, change, and stabilize for periods of time throughout the expanse of time. And then most importantly, morality and social norms change over time. And we can sometimes feel confident that we human beings, we in specific cultures, places, times, social groups, that we have created a better social and moral world through some of the changes which we have helped to create. Now, one place where an idea like this found expression was in the 20th century in the philosophical position of existentialism. And Jean-Paul Sartre, in an important essay, Existentialism as a Humanism, is a very interesting essay. But first, I'd like to quote from the essay, the descriptive and kind of analytical essay in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy on the topic of existentialism. Here is Sartre's slogan: existence precedes essence. And I'm now quoting from Kroll's essay. Sartre's slogan, existence precedes essence, may serve to introduce what is most distinctive of existentialism, namely the idea that no general, non-formal account of what it means to be human can be given, since that meaning is decided in and through existing itself. There is no essential humanity, in other words. There is only what we have made of ourselves. Back to the quote, existence is self-making in a situation. Weber puts the point this way. This is not Weber, by the way, it's a different author. Weber puts the point this way: classical existentialism is the theory that existence precedes essence. That is, there is no such thing as human nature in an Aristotelian sense. A, quote, person does not have an inbuilt set of values that they are inherently structured to pursue. Rather, the values that shape a person's behavior result from the choices that they have made. In contrast to other entities whose essential properties are fixed by the kind of entities they are, what is essential to a human being, what makes her who she is not fixed by her type, but by what she makes of herself, who she becomes. The fundamental contribution of existentialist thought lies in the idea that one's identity is constituted neither by nature nor by culture, since to exist is precisely to constitute such an identity. It is in light of this idea that key existentialist ideas such as facticity, transcendence, alienation, and authenticity must be understood. Now, I offer the example of existentialism and Sartre's idea of self-creation. I offer it as an imperfect illustration of the central idea which I am putting forward for us to consider, because I'm not thinking so much of the individual, but rather of human culture over time, that humanity is self-constituting through the cultures, the religious ideas, the moral values, the patterns of social interaction that we have created, and that there is no more fundamental, no essential moral and social universe to which we can refer. There is simply the creation of humanity of its own context of cultural and moral values. Here's a longer quote from Sartre in Existentialism is a Humanism. And this is a short essay, which I've put up in the files area. And I won't read this quote because you can read it in the printed version of the slides. But this idea of self-creation, whether of an individual through his or her actions, or in the sense that I'm interested in articulating, this idea of humanity and human culture as being self-created, this idea finds itself in opposition to several kinds of fundamentalism. First of all, to philosophical fundamentalism, the idea that human nature is fixed and unchanging, and whenever a generation is born, we take on the human nature which it is essential that we assume. So philosophical fundamentalism, or possibly Aristotelianism, is the idea that human nature is fixed and unchanging through all time. But this position is also opposed to moral foundationalism, the idea that there is one permanent and unchanging set of moral principles that are binding at all times. This view is also in contrast to biological fundamentalism, the idea that human behavior is governed and determined by some kind of code created by the evolutionary history of our species. Darwinism and neo-Darwinism, the idea that individuals simply pursue their own survival, and that is their biological necessity. The view which I'm putting forward, human nature as culturally constituted, basically disputes the idea that there is a biological fundament to human motivation, human morality, and human normative behavior. Against all of these fundamentalisms, the view that I'm proposing to you today holds that human beings are what you might call general purpose life machines, capable of creating cultural and moral innovations that permit us to live better and more harmoniously together. But of course, there's no guarantee that changing cultures lead to better cultures. And so this is a point that Sartre understands very well for the individual. The choices that an individual makes may lead to a worse individual, a despicable individual, and likewise with human cultures. It is, in some sense, a choice of ours, whether our culture leads us to a better and more harmonious society, a more just society, or to a more cruel and more atrocious society. So what is it that a person or a philosopher or a thinker might be looking for in asking for a theory of human nature? Well, it is a conception of what human beings want in their actions, what motivates them. It is a conception of how human beings think, how we deliberate. Do we make use of rationality and reason? Are we driven by emotion, passion, sympathy, compassion, hatred, fear, envy, indifference? What are some of the modes of thinking and processing which human beings do as we navigate the world? A theory of human nature is a view of the ways that human beings think about and interact with societies, with the individuals and groups around them. So we might imagine a theory of egoism, a theory of altruism, and a theory of self-interest, and a theory of commitment to others. A theory of human nature will address the question of whether and how normative systems, ethical systems, can be effective or possibly not effective in guiding human behavior. And then finally, there's the question, is human nature malleable? Does it change over time? And I'm proposing that we think of human nature as indeed being historically changeable, historically malleable. Now, are there any philosophers who have advocated for such an idea? Well, oddly enough, there are. And at the turn of the 18th into the 19th century, the German philosopher Johann Gottfried von Herder was a very important philosopher. And Herder, I'm quoting actually from my essay on the philosophy of social science in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, Herder offers a strikingly different view about human nature and human ideas and motivations. Herder argues for the historical contextuality of human nature in a variety of works. He offers a historicized understanding of human nature, advocating the idea that human nature is itself a historical product, and that human beings act differently in different periods of historical development. Herder also sets the stage for historicist philosophy of human nature found in later thinkers such as Hegel and Nietzsche. Herder's perspective also prefigures an important current of 20th century philosophy and thought, which is the idea of the malleability of human nature. So Herder is actually an important philosopher for us to consider. I briefly considered asking you to read some excerpts from Herder, but then decided that's not essential for our purposes. What I do think is useful is a book by Sonia Sika, which is titled Herder on Humanity and Cultural Difference. This book is accessible through the library, and I've pulled out a couple of chapters. One chapter I've asked you to read, but if you want to read more of it, you have direct digital access to it. So you can just use the catalog to find it. But I am impressed with this book. I feel that Sonia Sika does a wonderful job, a very thorough job of reading and interpreting and presenting Herder's theory of human nature, of culture, and of a people in a way which is very accessible to us in the 21st century. She notes that Herder, and this is quoting from her, is commonly regarded as a founding father of the view that each of the world's many nations has a specific and uniquely valuable character expressed in the various facets of its collective life, its language and literature, its religion, traditions and customary practices, its values, institutions, and laws. He is therefore frequently mentioned in works dealing with culture or ethnicity, and it is rare to find an extended work on the subject of cultural nationalism that does not allude to the influence of his ideas. But what I would like to take from Herder is not nationalism. It is not the uniqueness and permanence of various ethnic identities. It is simply his historicism about the human condition, his idea that our most basic characteristics as human beings are themselves historically constituted at a time and place. Historicism, it seems to me, is very important, and it's important for our task in this seminar, confronting evil in history. Because the logical implication of historicism is that human individuals become specific, culturally instantiated persons through their immersion and development in a culture at a time. This casts doubt, in fact, it destroys the idea of any form of essentialism about human nature and about the characteristics of a people, or for that matter, of a culture. A culture and a culture's value systems, these are contingent facts about humanity. Contingent in the sense that they could have been different and they will be different. They change over time. And human individuals, the individual human beings to whom they give rise, are contingently different from their predecessors and their successors in other generations. So it's contingency all the way down. Human beings are a product of their cultures are a product of the things, the historical events which happen in a certain period of time, and the people of the next generation or multiple generations in the future are yet again different and give rise to new cultural variants. But this is all that we need in order to draw the conclusion humanity can change as a result of its historical experience. This is important for us in this course, because what I'm really wanting us to dwell on is the experience of evil in the 20th century. What can come of that experience? Can we as humanity, can we as a species become different, and become different in a way that makes Holocaust, atrocity, and the massive cruelties of Hitler and Stalin impossible in the future? And what Herder allows us to believe, and what Sartre allows us to believe, is that our histories change us, and we change the histories that we make into the future. There is another implication of historicism, and it is anti-essentialism. There is nothing essential about having the ethnic identity of an Armenian, a Spaniard, a Buddhist, or a Jew. It is an important fact about me that I am Armenian, or I am Spanish, or I am gay, or that I am a Jew. It is important to me in my current identity, but Jewishness or ethnic identity as an Armenian is not itself an essential feature of a population, essential and unchanging. Rather, we can recognize that national and cultural identities have a certain stability over time, but they also change over time. Being Armenian or being Jewish in 2021 is somewhat different than it was in 1921. So national and cultural and religious identities change over time. They are themselves historically located and historically malleable. Herder himself, the book that I've asked you to read a little bit of, she makes the very important point that Herder is not a cultural essentialist. He is sometimes accused of being one of the origins of Nazi propaganda, Nazi thinking, Nazi philosophy in Hegel. But her view is that that's not correct. Herder does not essentialize Jewishness or Christianity, or he is not racist, he is not anti-Semitic. Herder, quoting from her, Herder is actually not as strong a cultural essentialist as is sometimes thought. He explicitly acknowledges that cultures are not internally uniform, that they fuse to form new combinations, and that their evolution is shaped by interaction with one another. Parenthetically, he is a pluralist. On the latter point, far from holding the view that cultures should shun foreign influence, Herder largely sees cultural interaction as a good thing, as long as it is not the result either of violence or of intimidation arising purely from a sense of cultural inferiority. In other words, I think Sika would take the view Herder would be anti-Nazi rather than supporting Nazi beliefs about Jews and Aryans. Let's turn now to the biology question, the question of whether our evolutionary history predisposes us to a certain human nature. And Alan Gibbard, a really marvelous philosopher who spent a lot of his career at the University of Michigan. I've had the pleasure of having multiple conversations with Alan Gibbard over the past 10 years or so. But he wrote a book called Wise Choices, Apt Feelings, which tries to make sense of the intersection between moral psychology, the moral capacities and the moral reactions which we have as individual human beings, and the evolutionary experience of the human species, Homo sapiens. So let me quote a few lines as opposed to asking you to read his book. Quoting Gibbard, "How then are we to understand our normative life as part of nature? The key must be that human beings live socially. We are, in effect, designed for social life. Our normative capacities are part of that design." Now, what does he mean by design? Well, humanity has no designer. It is the result of evolution. So Homo sapiens became the psychological, neurological beings that we are through a million years of hominid evolution. Now I'm back to Gibbard in a second quote. "The key to human moral nature lies in coordination, broadly conceived. The need for complex coordination stands behind much of the way language works in our thoughts, in our feelings, and in social life. It figures centrally in our emotional dispositions, especially for such morally significant emotions as outrage, guilt, shame, respect, moral admiration, and moral inspiration." A couple more quotes from Alan Gibbard. And I don't think I'll read this quote because you can read it in the slides. But essentially, the position that Alan Gibbard is putting forward is that human evolutionary history is distinguished from other species by the fact that we evolved in a social context. We evolved in hunter-gatherer societies where cooperation and collaboration was essential to survival. And so his basic view is that we acquired certain very general capacities, cognitive capacities and emotional capacities, which facilitated cooperation and coordination. And Gibbard believes that those very same capacities, well, number one, they're very flexible. They can be embodied in many different kinds of social arrangements. But number two, they are the kind of biological and natural foundation of our ability to function as moral beings at all. If we lacked those moral capacities, then we might indeed be the kinds of creatures that are described in Hobbes's description of life being nasty, brutish, and short, where everyone is the enemy of everyone else. Maybe just the last two sentences. Propensities well coordinated with the propensities of others would have been fitness enhancing. Emotional propensities, I suggest, are largely the results of these selection pressures, and so are our normative capacities. In other words, he thinks there is an evolutionary basis for our capacity for moral emotions, but he does not believe that specific moral emotions are pre-programmed. This quote, I think, is important. "Human cooperation and coordination more broadly has always rested on a refined network of kinds of human rapport, supported by emotion and thought. A person sustains and develops this network of emotions and capacities, draws advantage from it, and on occasion keeps his distance from it. He does these things only in virtue of a refined configuration of emotional and cognitive dispositions." And so Gibbard's view is that the evolutionary history of hominids took place in a setting of social groups where psychological capacities supporting sociality and cooperation were favored and had selection advantage. This is related to the work by the biologist and writer Dawkins in the book Selfish Gene, which some of you may have read. What Gibbard believes is that these moral psychology facts give rise to a capacity for culture. And culture transforms humanity. Culture creates a set of moral and normative practices and constraints for human beings, which allow us to live in different kinds of social arrangements. His view is that the evolutionary history of hominids, including our species, resulted in a species that had a range of psychological tools that could be activated or deployed in a wide variety of ways. This prepared our species to become cultural animals capable of creating and living within social groups and cultural systems. And this process of creation had a great deal of flexibility, as human technological and linguistic capabilities demonstrated great flexibility as well. So now coming back to human beings, the historicist understanding of human beings and historicized human nature, how do human beings come to have a moral culture or a practical culture, a culture of action and sociality? Well, it's kind of obvious once we begin to think about it, how we became socialized to have one kind of human nature or another. Our families are crucially important, but then we can push that question back. How did our families come to have the norms and practices and ethical beliefs and sometimes religious beliefs which they had? Religious groups are another sort of influence on the moral culture that we absorb. Teachers that we have all the way from preschool through PhD. Novelists and poets, the novels, the poetry, the pieces of literature which we've read as adolescents and young people and mature people and older people, we are transformed by literature. And these experiences of reading Tolstoy or reading Grossman always have the capacity to change our way of thinking about how to interact with other human beings. I would also like to imagine that philosophers have the capacity to influence our moral culture. And sometimes regrettably, pundits and politicians have a capacity to inspire, to activate, to mobilize, and to encourage certain kinds of moral practices and moral beliefs and to discourage others. So how is this topic relevant to our study of evil and the evils of the 20th century? I would say that this historicist or existentialist understanding of the human being is encouraging when it comes to the topic of confronting evil. Because we are capable of changing our values and our expectations of each other. We are capable of learning of the capacity. It's a sad, it's a mortifying lesson to learn, but we are capable of learning of the capacity of ordinary men to do horrible things, horrific things. And this learning can lead us to attempt to create new values, but also new institutions that make atrocities less likely. In a very real sense, human culture can be different in the 21st century as a consequence of acknowledging and studying and suffering through the history of the atrocities and the anguish of the 20th century.